Food and drink, hunger and thirst. It's all part of the actor status system introduced with Star Citizen 3.9. But what's its real impact to the player? Does being thirsty cause any problems? How long does it take before you need to eat or drink something? Can you actually die from it? I'll answer all that and more, but be prepared that over 30 hours of testing is compressed into just a few minutes, so it's a lot of information.
Many Bothans died to bring us this information.
So let's get straight into the data. At first, you will be at full hydration and full nutrition. It takes a good while before your hydration and nutrition start to fall. For hydration, it takes about 1 hour and 20 minutes before you see the meter. When standing still indoors, the rate is about 1% every 2 minutes and 5 seconds. If you're sprinting everywhere like a maniac, then you do dehydrate faster. It's closer to about 1 minute 45 seconds at a continuous sprint. I reran all these tests in this video over and over to get the best data I could, and there were a couple times when sprinting, the rate didn't seem to drop. But after a few dozen time trials in different situations, up and down steps, on flat surfaces, and so on, by far the predominant result was an increased rate of thirst. Interestingly, on a couple of these tests, the rate of dehydration seemed to increase on its own as it got lower. But logging out and back into the game seemed to reset this slowly escalating rate. But I'm really unsure about all of that. I couldn't consistently duplicate it. Maybe it's not supposed to increase over time, or maybe it's supposed to increase but the log out messed that up. I just don't know. But it was interesting to see something change. It would be very cool and like CIG to put an escalating curve on something like that. What didn't seem to affect the rate of dehydration were planetary conditions. I went to Daymar where it's relatively hot, and I went to Microtech where it's relatively cold, and did some time trials there and got the exact same results. So right now, the planets or moons really don't seem to affect it. At about 40%, you'll start to get a yellow bar underneath to get your attention, just in case you haven't been watching your levels. I let my hydration get down to just under 25% at one point and wasn't noticing any negative effects from it. No blurring of vision or slowness or anything. So I was extremely curious. Can you actually die from thirst or hunger? So I put it to the test. It does take hours for these timers to count down, and on my first attempt, I got just below 25% thirst when somebody at Levski, taking advantage of a bug in the armistice zones, shot me and killed me. But
I am a scientist on an important mission.
So I persevered. It wasn't until about 11% thirst that I noticed things starting to get a little wonky. My vision started to get ever so slightly blurry. It became very noticeable at about 7%, and I could hear my heart beating, and the whole display of everything started going double vision. In that last 1 to 2%, it did get pretty desperate, with the indicator flashing and the vision very blurry. I liked how distant things were worse than close things, and it was worse around the edges than the middle. Very well done, I thought. Always that extra visual touch over just getting general blurry vision of the whole screen. So would I die at 0%? No. But my little survival timer still showed a precious 2 minutes. Would I die then? Would my heart rate suddenly spike? Would I start staggering? It was all rather sudden. I had planned to take a drink at the last possible second and see if it would instantly fix me. But alas, I forgot to remove my helmet, and I watched my life pass before my eyes, and my water bottle hit the floor from my cold, dead fingers, while an innocent citizen watched in amazement. It was good that it turned out that way, though. I might have had a hard time actually killing myself, and I did get to see what actually would happen. So yes, death is real. Looking at food, it took considerably longer to start to degrade. It took about 1 hour and 50 minutes before the hunger bar started to show up, and its rate of decline was slower at about 3-ish minutes per every 1%. Maybe that's a little off, but it was definitely a slower decline than thirst. The rate of hunger too increased under full sprinting and dropped to about 2 minutes 35 seconds. I guess I was burning up a lot of calories. While under a walk, the rate also increased a little, but not as much as the full sprint. My average was about 2 minutes 50 seconds for each percent. Not a lot, but it was consistent. So exertion does affect the rate of dehydration and hunger. I would actually call that at least tier 1 and not tier 0. So these variable rates of increase were not something I expected to see right away. It was pretty cool. That's how it affected me. What about the food and drink itself? Food and drink has a nutritional density rating, NDR, and hydration efficacy index, HEI. The higher the value, the better the food and drink is at satisfying your hunger and thirst. So if you need water, you can eat or drink something with a HEI. And if you need food, you need to have something with an NDR. Many of the food and drink items have both HEI and NDR in varying quantities, so you might wind up having one or two favorite foods. I think these higher HEI smoothies might be among my favorite with the energizing blue bilva food, but it's hard to beat a good apple. Maybe I'll just store creative apples on my ship. There is some tier 0 spoilage in place that's implemented as a preset value of whether or not you can store an item. Things like the sandwiches, burgers, and open slice of watermelon all could not be stowed in my personal inventory, which makes sense. Those things would go bad relatively quickly, so need to be consumed immediately. Things like an apple or a prepackaged smoothie you could store and take with you. This little subtlety was, again, the kind of variety that adds that extra little bit. So it was nice to see some of it already being thought out and put into the game. We have yet to know if any of the stowed things will spoil, and they might do that in the future, but time will tell. CIG is always slipping in the little bits of the unexpected. Food and drinks also have effects beyond the simple hydration and nutrition. There are quite a few other statistics that will buff or debuff you. I found a slew of effects on many of the available things you can buy, but I didn't exhaustively go everywhere and examine every possible food and beverage. That would have been quite a bit. And what's available is likely to change as we move forward. Some of these buff things might be hard to test unless you had just the right circumstance, like immune boosting. But I wanted to see if any of them were in effect right now, like hydrating. It says, allowing you to satisfy your thirst for longer. So I'd imagine that the timer, which ticks down your hydration, runs a little slower. And the dehydrating one makes it run faster. With my lifeline running low, I gave a drink of pure water with the hydration buff. It had an HEI of 44 and gave me back 6% per gulp. What was interesting is that after the second drink, my meter showing me the decline went away, which in hindsight I think meant that I had staved off the dehydration decline. 5 gulps later, I was at 33%, still in the low zone, but it wasn't showing on my screen. So I waited to see what would happen. After 5 minutes, given my previous rate of dehydration, I should have seen at least a 1% drop, but it was still at 33%. After 10 minutes, it remained at 33%, and after a full 30 minutes, it was still sporting 33%. So this hydration buff must do what we suspect, only maybe a little better. It seemed to stop the loss of hydration, similar to when you first start out at an optimum hydration level, and have to wait over an hour to start seeing a decline. With the 5 sips I had, it was a little over an hour, about an hour and 15 minutes before the meter started moving again. When it did start moving, The loss was right back at my 2 minutes and 5 seconds per percent I had already seen before. To see how much nutrition I receive from food, I again let things get very low and ate an apple, which has an NDR of 18 and an HEI of 6, with a hydrating buff. It gave me 18% nutrition and 6% hydration. A second apple later on gave me the same thing. That first apple held my hydration meter steady for 15 minutes. I was starting to see a little bit of a pattern here. The NDR and HEI values matched the percent that I was getting back. So I tested this again with water. It has an HEI of 44, and with my meter at 8%, I started drinking. It took 8 sips to down the whole thing, and I was getting roughly 6% back with each one, except the last one, which was clearly a partial drink. But all total, I ended up back at 52%, an exact increase of 44% to match the 44 HEI. So I was convinced you can pretty readily gauge the replenishment percent based on the HEI or NDR number. It's just that some things are consumed all at once, and other things take several bites or gulps. It also seemed that with the hydration buff, it was related to the HEI number and how long it was going to stave off that thirst. The hydration buff of the apple, with an HEI of 6, kept my meter steady for 15 minutes. The 5 gulps of water, which gave me about 30% back and consumed what I assumed to be about 30 HEI, kept the bar steady for almost an hour and 15 minutes. So, there does seem to be some correlation between the duration of the buff and how much of the HEI you're consuming. It is possible to use this stability to overbuff, like to overhydrate, but not in a bad way. You can extend the period of time before your hydration or nutrition starts to fall beyond what is set by default when you initially spawn or from death. For consistency, all the numbers in this video are based upon an initial spawn and not the overbuff. It was a little difficult to completely test how far you could extend this overbuff, but in my testing, I was able to push this stability from an hour and 20 minutes on hydration to somewhere between 3 to 4 hours by chugging down whole bottles of water well after I was 100% hydrated. I was hoping that if I only had one bottle and needed to spend some time out in the verse, I could ration my water and take just a couple sips at a time. But what I noticed out of this is that once you opened a bottle and took a drink, you could no longer stow this back in your personal inventory. I suppose they're afraid of it leaking out or something. I tried putting the bottle on my ship here in 3.9, but onboard items or boxes are still disappearing. So that isn't fixed and isn't an option to save your drink. So what happens if you do log out? I did this several times, both by intention and by letting the session time out. When I did leave the game and come back, the hydration and nutrition were at the same level as when I logged out. On a few game crashes, the levels went up, but that's probably related to the crash and the server not staying refreshed on my status. It only knew what it knew about me from the time a few minutes prior.
Insufficient data. Please specify parameters.
So what did I think about all this? From start to finish, I had almost exactly 4 hours and 40 minutes before I needed to take something. So it means you'll need to drink or eat something or hydrate in some way about every 4 hours while in game, which seems reasonable. It drops quickly enough to actually make it a thing in the game, and something you'll need to monitor, but not something to be disruptive, I didn't think. And bringing a simple bottle of water or a couple apples with you should be plenty. When CIG talked about this, I didn't think too much of it. I thought it'd be nice to have another thing to have as a living part of the verse, but literally having been through it cradle to grave, I started to like it. I can see on extended voyages to Pyro, where there's maybe nothing, having to bring supplies with you becomes a necessary prep action. Or maybe even when they have exchangeable saddlebags for the mole and ship-to-ship refueling, a person might want to stay for several game hours out in the space mining, logging out and right back into the ship and living off the consumables on board. Or the long-awaited exploration, where you just head out and find things with the probability of encounters in place. You might never want to leave the Carrack and send crew members out periodically for supplies. So it's a very cool idea, and one I can see we need to have now and get balanced and polished in order to make those other types of things possible. I hope you liked this video, and let me know what you think about the food and drink thing. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. Feel free to like and subscribe if you want to. Use my referral code if you want to get into Star Citizen, and I'll be talking to you later.